Hey everyone, it's good to be back here with you today. My name's Forrest, and we're going to be talking about this game, Driver San Francisco. Driver San Francisco is an interesting game, and I think the best place to start with any story on a game is kind of its development and its history, etc. The game was developed by Ubisoft and released in kind of later 2011. And 2011 was an interesting year to be releasing a game. Just off the top of my head, some of the competition for Driver San Francisco was Portal 2, Arkham City, Skyrim, Dead Space 2. And so if you were not one of those heavy hitters, I think there was a chance that you could get left on the wayside. And in some ways, and in some years down the road now, I think Driver San Francisco has really found its place in the community and in discussions, because while I had this in my collection for a while, that's actually why I decided I wanted to start checking it out. It's because I was on YouTube and I was watching some interesting videos about the background, the story, the writing in the game. And so I really wanted to experience that myself and see if I can kind of come to the same conclusions as what I was finding so intriguing about it. There were some interesting things that Ubisoft decided to do with this game. Starting with, we'll look at the box art. Not anything too particularly interesting going on here. I always find it funny when you look at modern games and the box art on the front is going to be the same as the box art that you see on the manual, which is the same as the box art you see on the CD. And of course, it is nice that it did have an insert. And when we look at the insert, all we get is some health alerts, PlayStation Network alerts, and ironically, my whole copy for some reason is in French, I believe. But then on this last page, there was something related to Uplay. And Driver San Francisco was Ubisoft's experiment at implementing the Uplay passport. So when we go back to 2011, publishers were very curious in understanding, hey, how can we keep people from going to GameStop, buying used games at a cheap price, and still using our servers and multiplayer, etc., in order to enjoy the game we made? That's the last thing we want gamers to do, is enjoy the game. And so a couple of these big publishers, Ubisoft was one, EA was another, began to implement these passports. And essentially what this passport was is when you bought the new game, you'd get an insert with a code, and that code would allow you to unlock what is essentially the DLC to play the multiplayer modes, maybe to enjoy a couple of other little experiences. So if you got a used copy, you're often not going to have that in the box, and it would require you to go online digitally and purchase it. And they were usually like $5 to $10 for most games. Now, fortunately, as you know, these passports don't really exist. So obviously there was a lot of pushback from the community. It's something that got dropped, and I think now we live in a better modern era for titles, and they don't have to deal with that kind of thing. But upon release, the game did pretty good critically, like 8 out of 10s, generally favorable. It sold pretty decently to my understanding, and that was good because Driver San Francisco was a continuation of Driver 3's story, and it had been quite some time in development. I think about 5 years, 5 or 6 years. So, and let's talk about that story. So this picks up after Driver 3. You play as Officer John Tanner, undercover, and he drives a 1970s, I think, SRT of some kind. And essentially what's happening in the story is he's going after Jericho, kind of his number one nemesis, I'd say. And he arrests him. Jericho gets away when he's being transported. And ultimately John ends up in a crash attempting to apprehend him. And when John wakes up from the crash, he realizes he has these powers to shift and traverse the city by flying up into the clouds, and he can go to any car, and he can zap himself into the body of the person driving the car. And so this is kind of what the entire game is built around, is this shift mechanic. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the cool ways in which they designed the gameplay around shift. But the first half becomes John's realization that Jericho is attempting to build a chemical bomb that he wants to set off in the city of San Francisco, where the game is set, while the later half deals more with what's happening with John. How did he get these abilities? How is his health? And what is that all about? And throughout the process of the story, I found myself much more enjoying that latter half. The first half is very by the book, I'd say, like undercover detective game or story or whatnot, while the later half is more interesting, dealing with John's psychology and what's happening with him, etc. I also found that the game is inspired by and borrows a lot of these kind of 1970s cop tropes, which is why I believe the game is set in San Francisco. Whoever the development team was, or whoever had the idea for this, obviously was a fan or was interested in the Dirty Harry series and the city of San Francisco. For that, there's a lot of muscle cars and old school classic cars in the game, which come straight from those kind of movies. And they seem to have wanted to design a lot of the gameplay experiences, from chases to action sets, around some of these environments and situations. So overall, I found the story to be more interesting in the later half. Earlier on, I had to kind of skip and jump through a couple cutscenes to keep my interest, or pull up Reddit while we're going through it. But I did find myself enjoying the conclusion and enjoying a lot of those later pieces. Kind of in line with what I was just discussing on the set and the environment in San Francisco, the sound design is really great for some of the cars. The whole game uses licensed vehicles. They sound how you'd want. If you have a muscle car, it sounds, hey, that's a muscle car. If it's a sports performance car, it sounds exactly like that in quite the same way. Otherwise, the music is, again, kind of this 70s aesthetic. You have a lot of alternative or classic rock. There's jazz, there's some like funk and electronica and breakbeat. And I found it to not be too inspiring from the lens of, I'm going really fast in this car, and then I'm hearing a little saxophone playing over top of that. So the appeal didn't really fit with me. It didn't really make me feel the adrenaline pump that I would want to. But overall, I ended up just switching it off and really just enjoying the environment and the game sounds. And I think from a car perspective, you get a lot of that. The city itself, nothing really sticks out in my mind as I remember the environmental sound design, or I remember hearing or seeing things out on the street that weren't coming directly from my vehicle. However, they put a lot of time and effort into making those sequences effective anyway, because there's a lot of writing and dialogue, not just happening in the story missions, not just happening in the side missions, but also happening just when you're shifting and free roaming and driving around. If you have passengers in the car, sometimes you'll jump right into a conversation, or they'll be remarking on the ways in which you're driving. So I did find that very entertaining and enjoyable, and the voice acting was very effective and paired well with the type of writing that the team was going for. I found it clever and witty, and again, very entertaining from that lens. Graphically, this is like mid-generation PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 era. So what we got, along with the aesthetics that I've already talked about, is kind of these washed out yellows. It's kind of like you have this filter of orange and yellow all over the screen, and the game taking 10 to 15 hours maybe to really give a full pass on. I found myself to be thinking, I wish they had done more visually with this game. Comparing it to some of the titles that I was mentioning earlier from the 2011s. The graphics are not up to that standard and par, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be. But what really matters then is the art style and what you're doing with the art style. And from that lens, I feel like the game is one whole shade of yellow, whereas they could have done a lot more with it. And I know that's the case, because when you play some of the story missions, some of them are like foggy and gray. And towards the end, when John is having these out-of-body experiences, the city is sometimes bathed in these blues and these darker colors. And it looked great in all of those environments. And so when I thought about what could have been done from a development lens, I think it would have been great if they had added in some kind of weather or time of day effects, even if it just went from, say, morning to afternoon, or also night would have been very entertaining. And they didn't end up doing any of that. And I get that that could also have some impacts on gameplay and what you want to do with it. However, I think it would have added to creating an experience that was a little more visually diverse and interesting to look at. I also found that the city of San Francisco itself is designed in a way that maybe doesn't fit San Francisco. And I'll give you an example of, if you're driving a car through the city of San Francisco, this is a place that's, 7 by 7 square miles. It's not a very large place. And so driving on the Golden Gate Bridge in this game, for example, including your entrance and your exit ramps, there are 14 lanes, all of which the lanes are much wider than would accompany even like a semi-truck. And create a situation where everything is so big around you that there's a scaling issue, I feel like. In the real world, this bridge has 4 lanes, I believe, at most. And so as a result, you kind of lose this tight and claustrophobic and narrow driving situation that could have been designed while also keeping the speed of the gameplay up. And what I mean by that is, because everything is so big, you'll be driving in a sports car going 100 miles per hour in Driver San Francisco, but it really doesn't feel like it, because the pace at which you're actually moving is not representative of what you would see in the real world when you think about it from a scaling perspective. And so it really takes until late into the game before you start getting into vehicles where you're saying, wow, I'm actually going really fast. And I did kind of find that to be disappointing from the lens of just enjoying that adrenaline rush. You know, that's one thing that's so great about playing racing games, is having that experience. And in some ways, a little bit of that was missing here for me. But otherwise, the gameplay is really exciting. So you kind of have a few things going on. You have story missions, and in these story missions, you'll do things such as police activities, chasing people, taking down cars, racing activities where you've shifted into the body of these 2 young men, and they're unexpectedly winning first place in all these street races and getting all this money, and it's kind of a funny arc you follow throughout the game. And then, of course, you'll be doing your main core missions to kind of go out and catch Jericho. And then outside of that, you have activities and dares. So one dare might be, hey, drive 100 miles per hour for 20 seconds. Or one activity might be to shift and find a vehicle, whichever one you want, and take it to a race and go win that race. And so there is some interesting freedom there. I think what happens with the game is you kind of have 2 different experiences happening at once, because the game's free roam is built on you kind of upgrading a few skills that you have, whether that's the boost or whether that's your ability to kind of build up and ram into a vehicle to help you take them down. Or you can do things like buy a thrill cam or increase the multiplier of the income and dollars you're getting from all these activities and dares. However, the story missions don't supply you with a lot of that cash. The quickest way to get the cash is to go out and do all these side activities and dares, etc. And so you end up kind of playing 2 games. You're playing one where every story mission, you already have the vehicle determined for you, you already have the objectives determined for you, and then these activities which are a bit more free roam. I think what would have been more effective overall for the cohesion of the game is if there was a little more freedom or a little more restriction one way or another. Such as, if you could go do these story missions and you could bring whatever car you wanted to, that could really change the dynamic of how that story mission would play out, and also add a little freedom for you to kind of work the story mission itself. And now that is not to say that a number of these missions will say, hey, take down XYZ car. And so one way you can go about doing that is you can shift from your vehicle chasing them and make it a lot easier to go snag a car in the oncoming lane and just crash it into your target. Or you might be in a race, and then you can shift ahead, and while the race is going on, you can get in a bus, you can block the road for all of your opponents, and then you can drive around it so that you can maintain your first place. And so there are a lot of very interesting ways you can use some of the gameplay design of the shift. And I did find myself enjoying that and having this opportunity to think about, oh wow, this is really cool what they've decided that I can and cannot do with a lot of this. But overall, I think those are kind of the core of my thoughts on the game. When it comes to replaying Driver San Francisco, it's an interesting game to experience once, especially for the story. The driving is on par with a lot of the titles of its generation, and I did find it entertaining, but it did take some time for me to get there and enjoy it because, especially as I mentioned with the scaling situation, a lot of the vehicles don't feel as fast as they necessarily say you're going. A lot of the races and activities and missions aren't challenging until you get towards the end of the game, and so as a result, I didn't find myself. I enjoyed it. I didn't find myself overall like going out of my way to say, "Hey, this game is one I'm going to pick up again in the future and really love and enjoy every part of it." But Driver San Francisco is definitely worth the playthrough, and definitely worth again experiencing that story throughout. And so those are kind of my overall conclusions. I think it's a decent game. I can get why people will say this is a hidden gem, especially nowadays. I don't think you can play this digitally anywhere unless you have a physical copy somewhere that you picked up. Driver San Francisco is pretty inaccessible. The multiplayer is shut down, and so really it's just diving into that single player. And so I would say if you can get your hands on it, it seems interesting. It seems pretty collectible in the future if Ubisoft maintains that status for it. And yeah, you should definitely give it a check and see what you like about it. I guess if you have played Driver San Francisco, would like to know your thoughts. Did you like it? Did you have similar conclusions? All in all, I really appreciate you sticking around and hearing out my thoughts. And I look forward to seeing you all next time. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.